All right, what's going on, guys? Today we're going to be walking through how you can optimally prompt Claude Fable 5. Okay, Claude Fable 5 was just re-released to the public around, I believe it was yesterday or the day before. Okay, so very recently. And what Anthropic is saying over here in this document is that prompting Claude Fable 5 is a lot different from prompting previous models. Okay, prompting Opus, prompting Sonnet. Because of the increased capabilities that Fable 5 is able to offer, there's a specific way that they recommend to prompt it to get the maximal use out of it. And so today we're going to be walking through this whole document that Anthropic has given us on the best ways to prompt Fable 5 to get our desired output and to be able to actually use it to the best of its capabilities. So let's get started. All right, first of all, Anthropic is saying here that Fable 5 has several behavioral differences from Opus 4.8 that require prompt or scaffolding updates. And throughout this document, they actually give us a bunch of specific prompts that we can literally paste into Fable when we ask it to do something that'll help align its behavior to do actually what we want it to do. To start off, some of the capability improvements. So let's just run through these really quickly. Compared to Opus 4.8, Fable 5 shows improvements in number one, long horizon autonomy, meaning Fable 5 is able to take on more complex tasks with a higher level of autonomy, right? So not having to check in with you at multiple touch points throughout the process like predecessors like Opus 4.8 had to do. Secondly, first shot correctness on complex, well-specified problems. Okay, so not only is it able to complete these long horizon tasks, it's able to do it with a higher level of accuracy, right? Many people have reported that they've been able to do single pass implementations, meaning that they can literally just prompt Fable to do something, a complex task, and it's able to complete it over a multi-day time horizon without much need for iteration throughout the process. All right, number three, vision. Right, Claude Fable 5 is much better at extracting value from technical images, web applications, pretty much just analyzing different visual sources and able to make sense of them, right? So the examples here are technical images, web applications, screenshots, pretty much anything visual that you want Claude Fable 5 to do is able to do it at a higher level of accuracy now. Number four, enterprise workflows. So this kind of ties back to the first couple, but this is more like a use case, right? If you're able to use Claude Fable 5 in enterprise workflows, it's able to follow the instructions more closely, stay within scope, basically complete these projects to a higher degree of accuracy and with less effort on your part because it's able to one-shot them more often. All right, next one, code review and debugging. Basically, Fable 5 is good for actually debugging stuff within your code base, finding bugs, cybersecurity flaws, all that stuff at a much better rate than Opus 4.8 was. Okay, so it's able to search across code bases, repository history, and find vulnerabilities and places where you can debug the code. All right, next one, navigating ambiguity. This is very similar. They're basically kind of reinstating the fact that it can run with long horizon autonomy. Okay, so the reason it can do that is because it's able to navigate ambiguity a lot better, make sense of ambiguous instructions, and do that at a higher level of autonomy. The last one is delegation and collaboration, right? So Fable 5 is able to more reliably utilize sub-agents to handle different sub-tasks that come along with a macro task. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about the parallel sub-agent section over here. But that's essentially what separates Fable 5 from Opus 4.8, and what Anthropic is basically saying is that with all these changes come a few different little nuances that we have to add to our prompts to be able to utilize Fable 5 to its fullest extent. So let's get into the actual changes you can make to your prompts to accomplish this. All right, so number one, as we mentioned, Fable 5 is very smart, right? So on harder jobs that it's going to require more context, it's going to end up thinking for a longer time, right? We don't want Fable to think too much on how to best do a problem. We'd rather it actually take action than plan out the way that it's going to take that action way too much, right? Which it does have the tendency to do. It's naturally designed to do that, but sometimes it can take it way too far. So this prompt basically helps prevent it from thinking too much and just tells it to act when it has the information that it needs. All right, next, you want to consider all effort levels. So as you guys know, there's a setting on Claude which lets you tune the effort level to which it completes a task at, right? So basically it decides how hard the model works. And so more effort makes the model smarter, less effort makes it a little bit dumber. And there's a bunch of different tiers for effort, right? So what Anthropic is saying here, which is pretty much intuitive to what previous models have gone by, right? But you want to use high and X high to complete more complex workloads, and you want to save medium and low tiers for more routine work, so like the easier stuff. And what's interesting here is that Claude Fable 5, according to Anthropic, performs just as good on medium and low as prior models have on X high, and sometimes you can often exceed what prior models have on X high. Okay, so that should give you some idea of just how powerful Fable is. But that also means Fable can often act as an overachiever, right? It does more things than we actually initially want it to do. If you put Fable on X high, it could end up adding, features, refactors, or introduce extra stuff beyond what the task requires. And so you can basically add in this prompt to prevent it from doing that. All right, next, strong instruction following. Essentially, Fable 5 follows instructions very well. So you can basically give it a really short rule instead of a giant list of things it needs to do. And you can basically get it to complete tasks to a high accuracy with just a short, brief instruction rather than having to enumerate each behavior. Now, the problem there is that it can also end up talking too much and end up over-explaining things that it doesn't need to, right? What you'll notice throughout this entire document here is that Anthropic has basically engineered Fable to err on the side of overachievement rather than underachievement, meaning that it'll basically rather do more that the task doesn't necessarily require than do less and have like a lower quality of output. And so you can basically put this prompt into Claude to tell Fable to lead with the outcome. Basically, after it finishes completing the task given to it in a prompt, just outline very briefly what happened, what it found, and keep the output short by leaving out all the stuff that doesn't matter. Also here, if you're running a long-running workflow, let's say you give it a very complex task, then you basically want to tell Fable to only stop and ask you for guidance where it genuinely needs to. So you can put this prompt in there to allow it to do that, to only ask you for guidance when it's doing a destructive or irreversible action, a scope change, or anything else that only the human can provide. Everything else, it should basically autonomously do that, and which is what Fable is good for, right? Autonomously completing tasks that previously required a lot more of these check-ins. You can trust Fable to do these more complex tasks at a higher level of autonomy, and you want to basically prompt it like this to give it permission to do that. All right, next, when Anthropic tested Fable, they found that sometimes it could say that it did something, but didn't actually do it, right? And obviously, we want to prevent that from happening. And so in this prompt over here, basically before reporting any progress on the output of a workflow, it'll basically audit the claim against a tool result from this session. So it'll fact check whether or not Fable actually did something that it said that it did by referencing the specific tool result from the session. All right, this prevents Fable from giving you any false claims if it just wasn't even sure that it did something. All right, next, sometimes Fable will occasionally do extra things that you didn't ask for, right? For example, it could write an email that you didn't ask it to do, or it could perform some sort of action using some MCP that you don't want it to do, right? So it's important for Fable, if you want to get the best output, to define explicit constraints on what it should and should not do. Basically, this prompt allows you to define those constraints and outline those for it. All right, next, as we mentioned, Fable is a lot better at dispatching parallel subagents, right? So it can start different helper jobs to work on different parts of a long project at once. So we basically want to encourage Fable to use this strength that it has to delegate different tasks to subagents when applicable. Okay, so just putting in this short prompt over here prompts Fable to use subagents where necessary and to basically proactively manage these subagents so you get the best results from it. All right, next, this pretty much applies to any AI, right? We want to be consolidating information into markdown files, but Anthropic is really emphasizing it for Fable here, basically saying that Fable does better when it can write down what it learned and then read it later. So this can be just as simple as a single markdown text file, but we want to tell Fable to store one lesson per file with a one-line summary at the top. So basically consolidating information from what it's learned into a text file so they can reference it in the future. And then if we want to trigger the memory system from an existing history, we can put this prompt to remind Fable of its past sessions. So maybe not necessarily something tied to Fable, right? You kind of want to be doing this with every Claude Code project that you do, but this is just something good to remind us of how we can use persistent memory with our projects. All right, next, Anthropic has found that there's a rare case with Fable that when it's deep into a long job, it might stop and say, okay, I'll do X now, right? But not actually do it. Or it might ask for permissions to do something when it already really has everything that it needs to proceed with that task. So if you want Fable to truly be autonomous and really get the most out of it, then you want to basically give it this prompt. Okay, remind it, that it's operating autonomously and that there's not really a human watching over its shoulder waiting to approve everything that it asked for approval for, right? Basically prompt it to say that this is an autonomous job that you're operating right now and to only involve the human if it's absolutely necessary. I basically give it a hard rule here that asking permission after already discussing with the user the best way to approach something is not acceptable. Make sure to use this prompt to squeeze the most out of Fable and really turn it into that autonomous engine that you can use to complete a task end to end. All right, next, on really long job runs, right, when you're running a long complex workflow that you're giving Fable autonomy over, what Anthropic has found is that sometimes the model can start to worry that it is running out of space or running out of context. And it can often suggest to stop the workflow or to start over, which obviously you don't want to do, right? If it's running an autonomous job, you want it to complete it end to end. Right? And this usually happens when Fable sees an internal countdown of how much context is actually left for it to use. Right? So we basically want to gaslight Fable here. Right? We want to basically tell it that it should not look at the context countdown, and you basically want to reassure it that it has ample context remaining. right? So you can put this prompt in here to remind Fable that it can actually do the job that it set out to do and not to worry about running out of context or any context budget concerns. All right, next. So what Anthropic is suggesting here is that Fable performs better when it understands the reasoning behind a specific request that you give it. Don't just tell it to do something. Tell it the reason why you want that task done. This is more of a way that you can structure your prompts in general. But instead of just giving it request, you want to give it context to that request. So say that you're working on a particular task and say maybe, what's it for or who's it for, and then say exactly what the end goal is, right? What the output needs or what it really enables. And then with that in mind, then give your request on what you want Fable to accomplish to get to that desired output. And then lastly, on longer jobs or jobs that require more steps, the final message that Fable gives to the user when it completes that job can sometimes be hard to read, right? It can be full of different shorthand or different technical words and jargon. And this is because obviously Fable is condensing a lot of specific context of what it's done into a very short output summary. And so naturally, it's going to include a bunch of different technical jargon to try to convey a summary of what it's done better. But we want to prevent Fable from doing that, right? Obviously, after it's completed a task, we want it to give us a concise summary and prioritize readability over just throwing a bunch of technical jargon into its last output summary. What this prompt does is it basically prompts Fable to make its last output message to the user very clear so that we can understand a concise summary of what it's completed and where the workflow is at right now. And then lastly down here, Anthropic recommends some different scaffolding changes. One of the most important things that I think to draw attention to here is the point that they make here to refactor your existing prompts and skills, right? What they're saying essentially is that a lot of skills that you might have been using with Opus 4.8 or with Sonnet might be a little bit too specific for Fable to be able to use properly. But a lot of times with Opus models and Sonnet models, you really need to handhold them through a lot of tasks. With Fable, you don't need to do that. Fable has a lot more autonomy, and so you don't necessarily need all the handholding that is in a lot of previous skills that you may have written or in a lot of existing prompts that you might have used. And so you may need to refactor some of these existing prompts and skills that you've been using to give it the room to do that, rather than handholding it through the whole process, making it a little bit too prescriptive to instructions that you might have given to Opus or Sonnet. What Anthropic is saying here is that Fable 5 does a great job of also updating skills on the fly. So another thing you can do with Fable is basically just refactor the skills and prompts that you have and optimize them for Fable's usage. So that's basically how you can prompt Fable to squeeze the most out of it and how it's been different from how we've prompted previous models like Opus and Sonnet. So just a quick walkthrough there. Hope you found this helpful. And if you did, then like and subscribe. Helps out a lot. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Cheers.